So again, I want to kind of talk about why Climathon? Why are we putting on these events that combine so many different groups, audiences, and students? So in Central Ohio, we're facing a lot of different weather and climate related challenges when we're looking at any topic from infrastructure to healthcare, sustainability. And the simple fact is we need more people creating diverse solutions to the host of climate related changes we're facing. And the goal of all of these ideas and solutions is to make our communities more resilient. And as we saw, making our way through the pandemic and through various economic problems, there are ways to do this as long as we can kind of look within ourselves and work with our communities to hear ideas, to slowly iterate and build upon different ideas, and then bounce forward from different problems and not bounce backward. So that is kind of the spirit of the event. And as a result, last year we had a great turnout and some great ideas, and we have a very similar situation this year. We had a nice turnout. We had some really cool projects and ideas come to fruition today, and we'll get a chance to showcase this and talk about what everybody did down the road. But first, we wanted to bring in a special guest to share some more about what that spirit that I talked about it has been about. So I'm going to introduce Catherine Girves. Catherine is, well, do you want to come up and,
Sure.
and do your intro, and I'll switch the slides while you're doing so? Okay.
Yeah, so I am.
Stand over here, actually.
I am Catherine Girves. I work for a transportation consulting firm called Toole Design. My role there is as a principal planner. Do we need that? Let's make that go away.
Yes, no worries.
Okay. Cool.
Slideshow right here.
I'll throw that there. So I'm a principal planner at Toole Design. I'm also a year-round transportation cyclist. I use a bike to get most places, most days. I'm also a social justice warrior working on eliminating racism in my community and in myself. I am a mother. Periodically, I'm in trouble, and sometimes I'm a bit of a mess. I'm gonna just land here for a second. We humans are a fragile lot. And when we feel sad or overwhelmed or scared, particularly when we're isolated, we can get hopeless, angry, depressed, greedy. Welcome to the climate catastrophe. These are dangerous characteristics in beings who have the power to manipulate our environment as much as we do. So today I am going to talk about the power of storytelling, and in particular, how storytelling can break those dangerous feelings of isolation that make us as individuals and a species so dangerous. And this necessity of storytelling to reflect reality and as a tool to create beloved community. So as I mentioned earlier, I'm a transportation planner. I get to spend my time at work thinking about how people move from one place to another. That's often referred to as mobility, which has been defined in recent decades by the dominant culture of the movement of people and goods. That's probably a familiar definition to you all. It has this underlying assumption, that definition, that faster, farther, and in greater numbers is how we're going to define success. But I want to take a few minutes to examine those assumptions, what those assumptions have brought us by looking at the history of ground transportation. We have been walking for 5 million years. Cities were invented about 6,500 to 9,000 years ago, depending on what source you look at, and everyone in cities walked. There were no other roads. That was how you got from one place to another. Around 5,000 years ago, people domesticated horses, so now you could have chariots and carts and ride on top of horses. And then transit came along, often towed by horses. And then more recently, bicycles were invented. Then we got iron that wasn't brittle, which allowed us to make rails and have trolleys and trains. That was also pretty recent. But most recently, cars entered the scene. For about 6,500 to 9,000 years, walking was really important, either for you or you and your horse. It is really important to remember that cars are actually very new to the scene. The modernist values that got popular after the Second World War have only been around for about 85 years. That is under 1% of how long cities have been around. It's easy to forget that this more recent way of moving about and the infrastructure and language we've built to accommodate it is really an untested idea. We've all been sold this story about what transportation is that just isn't accurate. Cities and city making was a trial and error thing for thousands of years. And generally, cities got better every century until sometime in the 20th century when cars started having a major influence. Early in that century, almost every city in the United States with a population over 5,000 people had a transit system. Imagine that. Almost every city with a population over 5,000 people had a transit system that got you from one place to another, or walking. And every single street in the United States in every single city was a shared space. Over the last 85 years, the meaning of the word street has been altered from this idea of a shared space to instead mean car conduit. The story that the modernists told was very successful. It's hard for people to imagine streets being used for anything else in the present day. This change in definition of the word street forced people to come up with new terms to describe what for thousands of years was just the normal use of streets. Streets were public spaces that were used for traveling and also for commerce and socializing and celebration and communication and play. All of these things were just normal things that happened in streets. But when the word street was co-opted, a whole new language got invented to describe the streets and the functions of the streets, and it changed the whole idea of the street. They told a powerful story. You can see in this painting from 1888 that streets were these multiple purpose public spaces. Everything was designed at the human scale, the buildings, the furniture, the street itself, because cities were inherently about people. But we don't have to go back more than a century or to another continent to see this. It's visible in this photograph of my neighborhood just 4 miles away. This is the Bronzeville neighborhood in Columbus, 56 years after the first car was made in the United States. The main street in my neighborhood was still a public space that accommodated travel, a variety of modes of travel, and the life of the city. Following the Second World War, motoring became more ubiquitous and popular, along with untested ideas for how to limit the use of public right-of-way, and the scale changed. This is my neighborhood 15 years after this photograph was taken. In a handful of decades, out of thousands of years of streets, we saw the vast majority of the street space become the domain of the driver of motor vehicles. There was and continues to be a big struggle about who has priority, who gets to dominate the street, who's allowed to even use the street. And in that period of the 20th century, other important functions of the city that took place in the street got pushed to the edges, as you can see here. This was one of the greatest transfers of communally owned wealth. The right-of-way that is our streets, a place to be used by people of all ages and all abilities and all income levels, was transferred from the community as a whole to a much smaller slice of the population. In a handful of decades, most of us were duped into believing that this publicly owned space belonged to our entire population, was transferred to people of an appropriate age to drive, who had the intellectual and physical ability to do so, and the economic means to own a personal vehicle and a reliable enough cash flow to operate and maintain a personal car. People did not give up the street space willingly or silently. This was and is a very real battle. These images from the 20th century exemplify the early days of fighting the modernist redefinition of streets. This culture war to continue the story of what streets are for was so successful that it has become known as the conventional paradigm. Though the battle for what makes sense in this collectively owned space continues, there has been a loss of cultural memory. This story exemplifies the importance of storytelling to understand reality. Because the modernist values what has become known as the conventional paradigm just doesn't deliver what was promised: easy, fast travel. When I was a child, we were promised flying cars. Instead, we use tanks, tools of war, on the homes of our own residents. And to add insult to injury, my profession, captured by this paradigm, perpetrated structural racism and other forms of oppression, literally destroying the wealth of communities and individuals. So these values, these modernist values, are congestion is bad, speed is important, got to keep cars moving, a creation of a hierarchy of streets to popularize this model on the needs of the fast movement of cars. And it's worked because the modernists told a story that was individually appealing to those who had the power to make decisions and the people they listened to. They sold people an idea that you could get to work faster, to the grocery store faster, to all the places of daily life faster. But individually appealing things that do not consider the context, the community as a whole, typically not only hurt those targeted by oppression, they hurt everyone, creating a tragedy of the commons. This idea that our individual benefit is separate from community tears at the very fabric of community. Focusing on individuals at the expense of community and working in silos, simply put, creates bad public policy. So let's take a moment to remember cities were invented to bring people together, to exchange goods and services and labor and entertainment, and bring social contact and ideas together. Cities were actually designed to shorten trips, to get people in the same place, to make exchange easier. So let's go back to this widely accepted definition of mobility, the movement of people and goods. The idea of getting from A to B quickly, translated into a lot of the metrics that we are living with today, even though it does a great deal of damage to human bodies through injury and loss of life, our physical fitness, our respiratory health, our economies, our environment, and on and on. These underlying assumptions and metrics have normalized crashes like this. I think this is like a block from your house, Jason. Yeah. Leaving paths of destruction in our neighborhoods, resulting in little more notice than a social media post or a morning traffic report. Ooh, this is moving forward on its own. This particular crash didn't even make the news. So let's think about mobility within a context. There are many populations of people, not all of them able to or even wanting to drive. People have different capabilities and strategies for how they will move from one place to another. And we move for a reason. Movement is purposeful. My profession overwhelmingly focuses on work-related trips, but as you can see, work-related trips only account for about 20% of the places we go. It's absolutely possible, and it is happening at a smaller scale than I would like, but it is happening, that people are using stories, long-form stories like the one I just told, or short-form stories like this comic to help people think differently about what is possible. We also need to think about whose stories are being told, whose expertise is centered and whose is ignored. Specifically, we need to think about the successful role racism has played in creating current conditions, including the way it is leveraged to isolate us from one another and fall into anger, greed, hopelessness, depression, isolation. So at my workplace, leadership has asked all white employees, colleagues, friends, family members to consider several questions. Do I understand that not being racist is not the same as being anti-racist? Why am I so afraid to be brave enough to confront my power and privilege? What am I waiting for to decenter whiteness and realize just because I've never experienced it or seen it, the research to prove it, doesn't mean racism isn't real? What am I doing every single day to force myself to think about racism and white supremacy? What am I doing every single day to stop the killing of Black and Indigenous people? These questions help us create new stories, help us think about how we are going to problem solve and who we are going to problem solve with to create the communities we want. We have to stop doing this work in isolation in our workplaces, in our personal lives, and we have to listen to the stories that are being told and tell stories and risk being a mess. Let me escape from this and just say a few other things here. Thank you. So how does this play out in the day-to-day work of a transportation planner at the company I work at, Toole Design? As a planner, one of the things that people first think about is community engagement. How do we engage community to think about how we're doing the work we're doing? And that is important. And it's important who we engage and whose voices are, who's at the table and whose voices get brought into the table. But just community engagement isn't enough. We have to think about how it threads through all components of our work. And in particular, how the successful role that structural racism has played to keep us isolated from one another and to keep us caught up in patterns of franticness, in patterns of feeling like we have to do this alone, and in not telling the truth, and in pretending like we know things that we don't know. I don't know anyone who has not experienced imposter syndrome on a regular basis, and that is not going to help us get to where we need to go. So other ways that this influences that work that we do at Toole Design is in prioritization. For example, one of the things we've noticed is if we put out a trail plan, that's very attractive to the private market. We will see developers purchase land along those corridors, which results in displacement of some of the very people that we're trying to serve who don't have cars for mobility. And so as we think about how we do our work and how not to perpetuate the ways in which marginalization has played out historically in our work, we think about things like, where is the affordable housing? Where is long-term affordable housing? Where are the corridors where that exists? And how do we make sure that that's what we prioritize as we start building active transportation corridors so that displacement does not, displacement can be mitigated. It influences how we think about what infrastructure looks like. One of the things we hear in communities on a regular basis when we go out to do engagement is, are you building these bike lanes for us, or are you building them for the people who are going to come after we can't afford to live here anymore? And so thinking about how we incorporate stories into the very infrastructure of the work we do, images of who has been here, who lives here now, and who belongs here. So thinking about how art plays out in the infrastructure and the stories that that art tells to the people who live in a place and the people moving in. Being honest about the limitations in data. In my field, we use lots of crash data. Crash data is really important to a lot of the decisions we make. And crash data is pretty flawed. One, not every crash gets reported. Even if you want to report it, In the city of Columbus, for example, if there's inclement weather, there are often too many crashes for police to respond. And so if there's not a serious injury or a fatality, they do not come to the scene to take a crash report. There are other reasons crashes may not be reported. There may be people who are worried, who are making a decision between paying rent or feeding their family or paying insurance, and reporting a crash could have bigger consequences than they're able to bear. And so that may influence whether a crash is reported. People may just be afraid of how they're going to be treated if they report a crash, and not report a crash for that reason. And police will be the first to tell you they are not healthcare professionals. And when they're rating a crash on a scale of 1 to 5, 5 is pretty easy. That's a fatality. But to know whether it's a 3 or a 4 serious injury, or whether there's an injury at all, if someone's been hurt and has a shot of adrenaline and doesn't think they're hurt, police are not well positioned to make those decisions. And yet this is the data set through which we're making a lot of our decisions. So being honest about the limitations of our data sets is really important as we think about the value we give those data sets. Thinking about the design of the work we do. For the women in the audience, this may track with you. One of the things I do in my work is take small groups of decision makers, groups of 5 or fewer people out on a bike ride to understand how their community is currently functioning from the seat of a bike. And I took 2 groups out one day, one led by someone a few minutes behind me, and I led the group up front with a group of folks from the Ohio Department of Transportation. And the first group of people was all female, 5 women. And the second group of people was all men, 5 men. And we pulled over at the first stop after riding on a trail. And I said, "So what did you notice?" And the women said, "Well, there was a shopping cart I noticed that was parked next to the edge. And there was this area where the trees were in really close. So I was paying attention." And they went on telling the stories that people who are really impacted by rape culture would notice. And then the group of men pulled up. And I said, "So tell me, what did you notice?" "Oh my gosh, it was so beautiful. Did you see the river? And did you see the heron? And did you see the..." And so who you have at a table making decisions influences the expertise, the lived expertise that people bring to a decision-making table matters. This isn't just a cool Gap ad. This is real expertise we need. And we need to be thoughtful about whose lived expertise is missing as we're trying to make decisions to make better communities. We've even found thinking about this show up in a land use analysis as we are looking at a corridor and the history of what's happened on the corridor and how that might influence how people interface with us when we say, "Hi, we're from the city and we're here to help." And how it influences us and how we interface with people if we understand the context we're walking into. We may understand that, oh, this person's not trying to attack me. This person has heard a story year after year after decade that has been shown to marginalize them. So maybe I can listen really carefully as they're upset and let them get that out, and then we can get to a different place. It influences how we do field work. When I'm doing a walking audit of a community with a group of able-bodied people, it's really important to me to bring a stroller or a wagon with a toddler weighted something in it, a pumpkin, a watermelon, something, because as we're walking, there are things we will notice. But on every walking audit and we take turns pulling the wagon or pushing the stroller, there comes a moment where those of us who are able-bodied walk through an area not noticing something and realizing the person pulling the wagon is far behind us and we've missed something. So having lived expertise in your decision-making groups, in our decision-making groups, influences the work that we do. I think the most important thing I want to share with you is that to make change, we have to tell stories that people can relate to. And we have to think about who the audience is. If I speak in German and you speak in French, I'm probably not going to get very far speaking German to you. The way I'm dressed might matter. The way this costume that is the shape of my body and the color and the size of my body might matter. So thinking about what story we're telling, what language we're speaking, how we're presenting ourselves, and who the storyteller is, all of those things matter. So thinking about how to tell stories where people can imagine themselves in it, and listening to the stories that are already being told without just centering ourselves as the experts. And as I close, I want to apologize for the mess my generation has left yours. As a 58-year-old woman, I am very aware of what you all have walked into. And there are a variety of ways I could say, well, this is what was left to me and what was left to the generation before me. The truth is still that you are owed an apology. And I am so grateful for the work you all are doing in this area, and am very excited to see what you do and interested in supporting you, and happy to answer any questions you have. So
You have a remote audience too, so we'll have to check the chat.
I'll let you
I was gonna step up and
check the chat.
monitor.
Let's start with the question.
In addition to what you said about the two groups of ODOT employees picking up on different things as they were riding along, do you have any other like little snippets of it just matters who's at the table, and the aha moments that don't even be an aha to some populations?
Oh, millions of
Yeah.
them. Like oftentimes if I'm leading a ride, I like to have, my preference is to have a Black person sweeping the ride with me, because at some point on the ride, I'm going to, if I'm riding with traffic engineers, for example, we're going to go through a series of stop signs and have some conversation about, someone is going to bring up, man, it's really inconvenient to come to a full stop at every one of these stop signs. Do we really have to do that? And that often leads to a conversation about, well, what's going to happen if I don't stop at a stop sign, or if Jason doesn't stop at a stop sign, or another white person doesn't stop at a stop sign? What's our experience going to be? And what's Shira's experience going to be? Like, there are a variety of ways that we can tell stories about, or even there are often neighborhoods that have reputations. And so we're very deliberate about riding through those neighborhoods and noticing, like, is the reputation an accurate reflection of reality? I think my personal favorite is there's a corridor. I like to set up routes so that people invent the stories that I want them to know. And so there's a corridor in Columbus, some of you may know it, on Parsons Avenue near Children's Hospital, where there are 2 blocks of bike lanes that disappear in hashtag and gravel after you cross Livingston Avenue. And so I typically pull over in that hashtag and gravel and say to the group, which is typically transportation professionals or elected officials, and I say, well, what did you notice? And they say, where did the bike lane go? Like, the bike lane just ended. And then I say, oh, I know. Like, but that's probably where the project scope ended, and projects have to have scopes, and it would be great if it could go on and on. Yeah, but there was no notification that that bike lane was going to end. oh, actually, there was a sign. You probably missed it. I missed it the first several times I rode this because it gets caught in the trees. But no, there was a sign. Well, there's no way that bike lane could be 3 feet wide. That's what I thought the first time I rode it. But I actually went and measured, and that's what 3 feet feels like in a 6-lane road. So creating opportunities for people to flip the script to, when I first started doing these rides, I was an advocate. So I was often thought of the person in the public meeting to say all the things that those guys on the ride had said. And so being able to flip the script so they're the ones asking the questions and I'm responding in the way that they might respond in a public meeting is very helpful in people inventing and creating the education that you want them to have and influencing their work.
Other questions?
There's nothing in the chat.
Sure.
Okay.
So about like I mean, I'm very interested in city planning and the public input process in particular. But kind of going back to that, the power of the stories that we've learned. How do you like incorporate new stories and show that there are alternative stories to what could be without having an undue influence on that public input process and making it your input rather than the public process?
Right. It's a tricky line, but I do think it's important to remember that people only create the solutions they can imagine. And so it actually is important to share with people possibilities that they might not yet have thought of. One of my favorite engineers tells me, I actually don't need people to tell me what infrastructure solution they want. I don't need them to say I need speed bumps or a traffic light, or I don't need them to define the infrastructure. I need them to define what the problem is. Like I can use my technical expertise to go, oh, if that's the problem, then here's what we need to do. If the problem is speed, here are potential solutions to slow things down. But if people are talking about safety and the problem isn't speed, it's something else, like what we need is deeper information about what people are experiencing. I think the other thing that I've become really aware of since I joined the consulting world is there is certainly an increased interest since the uprisings following the murder of George Floyd in cities across the country in engaging audiences of people that have historically been left out of engagement processes. And one of the things we're noticing is just engagement fatigue. I was working on one project not in Columbus, in another city, where we were working on a trails project. And at the same time, a sidewalks project was going on. And at the same time, a on-street bike infrastructure project was going on and a transit project. And just a few years before, they had done a climate engagement process, and there was a housing one coming. Like there was lots of engagement going on. And each new set of professionals came to the same group of people who said, we already told you. And the response was often, oh, no, you told the transit people, we're the housing people. The general public doesn't care. Like it really is on us as professionals to figure out how to play well with one another and how to share information and then go dig in deep where we need to dig in deeper with more specific information. But there is this way in which I think it's disrespectful to expect people to engage with us over and over and over again rather than working together to figure out how to share that information.